Strasbourg, July 1518. The summer heat is absolutely suffocating. In the middle of a quiet, cobbled street, a woman steps out of her home and begins to dance. But there is no music. There is no joy in her eyes, only a blank stare and a violent, rhythmic twitching she simply cannot control. Her feet crack and bleed against the stones, yet she doesn't stop. 6 days later, the madness has spread. By the end of the week, 34 people are dancing alongside her. By the end of the month, 400. They are screaming for help, trapped inside their own moving bodies. This was not a festival. It was a death march. Welcome to the unseen past. Today, we step inside the terrifying reality of the 1518 Dancing Plague, a deadly psychological contagion that history tried to bury. To understand how a single dancing woman triggered a mass psychological collapse, we have to look at the world she lived in. The Holy Roman Empire in 1518 was not a place of light and Renaissance beauty. For the people of Alsace, it was a living purgatory. Imagine waking up every day to the smell of rotting crops and open sewers. For years, relentless frosts and brutal droughts had destroyed the harvests. The price of wheat skyrocketed. Families were boiling old leather and eating weeds just to survive. Starvation was slowly gnawing at the population, but it wasn't alone. New, terrifying diseases were sweeping through the filthy streets of Strasbourg. Leprosy was common, and a horrifying new plague, syphilis, was tearing through the city, covering people in agonizing ulcers. Death was everywhere. You could see it, smell it, and hear it in the constant ringing of the church bells. When people are pushed to the absolute edge of human endurance, their minds begin to fracture. The medieval mind didn't understand pathogens or psychology. They understood angels and demons. They believed they were being punished, that God had abandoned them, and the devil was stalking their alleys. Every shadow held a curse. Every illness was a divine judgment. The citizens of Strasbourg were physically starved, riddled with disease, and suffocating under the crushing weight of religious terror. Their nervous systems were collectively pushed past the breaking point. The city was a powder keg of untreated trauma. It just needed a spark. And that spark was Frau Troffea's first step. It started with one, but in a city suffocating from collective trauma, one is all it takes. Within hours, Frau Troffea was no longer alone. Neighbors who had stepped out to watch in confusion found their own feet beginning to twitch. Then their shoulders jerked. Before they realized what was happening, they dropped their tools, they abandoned their children, and they joined the frantic, silent rhythm. This wasn't imitation, it was an infection of the mind. Modern science calls it mass psychogenic illness, a bizarre phenomenon where extreme psychological stress mutates into physical symptoms, spreading like a virus through a fragile population. And the madness leaped from block to block. By the third day, the narrow alleys of Strasbourg were clogged with dozens of people, men, women, the elderly, even children. They danced until their clothes were drenched in sweat. They danced until the skin on their feet tore open, leaving bloody footprints on the cobblestones. Witnesses from 1518 described the dancers' faces not as joyful, but twisted in pure agony. They were crying. They were begging to be stopped, screaming for God's mercy. But their limbs refused to obey. It was as if an invisible puppeteer had seized control of their nervous systems. As the crowd swelled to over 100, the city magistrates panicked. This was no longer a localized incident. It was an epidemic, and to stop it, the authorities were about to make a catastrophic mistake. The magistrates of Strasbourg were terrified. They were watching their city tear itself apart, and they had no idea how to stop it. So, they turned to the medical elite. In 1518, medicine was governed by the ancient theory of the 4 humours. The physicians observed the violently twitching bodies, the sweating, the sheer heat radiating from the crowd, and they delivered their official diagnosis: hot blood. They believed the dancers' brains were literally overheating. And the cure? It sounds like absolute madness to us today, but their solution was more dancing. The doctors concluded that if the victims danced day and night without stopping, they would eventually burn off the hot blood and recover. So, the city council made a fatal decision. They didn't quarantine the sick. They didn't enforce a curfew. Instead, they cleared the guild halls and the grain markets. They ordered carpenters to construct a massive wooden stage right in the center of the town square. And then they brought in the music. Dozens of professional pipers, drummers, and horn players were paid by the city to play around the clock. The authorities thought they were creating a controlled medical treatment. Instead, they poured gasoline on a psychological fire. The relentless beating of the drums and the piercing sound of the pipes didn't cure the afflicted. It acted as a dark siren song. The hypnotic rhythm echoed through the narrow streets, pulling exhausted, traumatized people from their homes. Those who were already on the edge of a mental breakdown heard the heavy drums, and their bodies surrendered to it. What started as a desperate medical intervention had just turned the entire city into a massive, open-air death trap. By mid-August, the wooden stage constructed by the city council had become an execution block. The music never stopped. Day and night, the pipers played their relentless, maddening tunes, and the dancers, they couldn't stop either. Imagine the physical toll. These were malnourished peasants who had barely survived a famine. Now they were being subjected to extreme cardiovascular stress in the blistering summer heat. Their bodies began to break down. The first to fall were the elderly and the weak. Their hearts, pushed beyond maximum capacity for days on end, simply exploded. Sudden cardiac arrest claimed dozens of lives right there on the wooden planks. But the horror didn't end with death, because the crowd was packed so tightly and the compulsion to dance was so violent, the bodies of the dead were repeatedly trampled into the wood. For those who survived the heart attacks, the torment was bone-crushing. Eyewitness accounts speak of the horrific sounds echoing over the drums, the sharp snapping of tendons and the cracking of bones as exhausted legs finally gave way. People were dancing on broken feet, their joints dislocated. Their shoes had long completely disintegrated, leaving bloody streaks across the stage. According to some historical chronicles, at the absolute peak of the plague, up to 15 people were dying every single day. The city magistrates watched in paralyzed horror. Their cure had backfired spectacularly. Strasbourg was no longer just suffering a bizarre phenomenon. It was now dealing with a mass casualty event. The streets smelled of sweat, blood, and decaying flesh. The music had to stop. The stage had to be torn down. Science and logic had failed them. It was time to call for a different kind of salvation. The physical and mental toll had reached its absolute breaking point. Medicine had failed. The wooden stage was soaked in blood. The city council finally realized they couldn't fight this with logic. In the medieval mind, when the physical world collapses, there is only one place left to turn: the church. The local clergy stepped in and declared the plague a divine curse. They believed the dancers were suffering from the wrath of Saint Vitus, a Sicilian martyr who was said to punish sinners by forcing them to dance uncontrollably. This wasn't an illness anymore. It was a demonic possession. The authorities ordered the wooden stage to be torn down immediately. They banned public music. They banned dancing in the streets. The survivors, those who hadn't died of heart attacks or pure exhaustion, were loaded onto wooden wagons. Imagine the terrifying scene: dozens of emaciated, violently twitching people tied down in carts, being dragged up into the dark, forested mountains of Saverne. They were taken to a remote, damp shrine dedicated to St. Vitus, located deep within a cold stone cave. Once there, the priests performed a bizarre and desperate ritual. They placed small wooden crosses in the hands of the afflicted, and then they forced them into a specific type of footwear: bright red shoes, sprinkled with holy water and blessed oil. In medieval religious symbolism, the red shoes represented the burning away of sin. The priests chanted over the twitching bodies, commanding the curse to leave them, and slowly, miraculously, the dancing began to stop. Was it the power of religious suggestion, the shock of the freezing mountain air, or simply the fact that their bodies had absolutely nothing left to give? Whatever the reason, the curse of Saint Vitus was lifting. But the terrifying question remained: what had actually possessed the people of Strasbourg? Strasbourg eventually returned to normal. The dancing stopped, the dead were buried, and the plague of 1518 faded into history. But modern science couldn't let it go. What actually caused hundreds of people to dance themselves to death? We know it wasn't a demonic curse. So, what was it? Today, researchers have two main theories. The first is biological: ergot poisoning. Remember the terrible weather and the rotting crops we mentioned earlier? When rye gets damp, it can grow a toxic, black fungus called ergot. This fungus contains a chemical compound called ergotamine. It is the organic precursor to LSD. If the starving peasants of Strasbourg were eating bread made from infected rye, they were essentially being heavily dosed with a powerful hallucinogen. Ergot poisoning causes violent seizures, terrifying hallucinations, and a burning sensation in the limbs. It sounds like the perfect explanation. But there's a catch. Ergotism usually cuts off blood supply to the extremities. It makes movement incredibly painful. It is highly unlikely that poisoned people could dance for days on end. Which brings us to the second and much more terrifying theory: mass psychogenic illness. This isn't a biological virus. It's a glitch in the human mind. When a population is trapped in extreme, inescapable psychological stress like famine, disease, and religious terror, the mind fractures. To escape the crushing reality, the brain enters a dissociative trance. And because they lived in a culture that deeply feared the dancing curse of Saint Vitus, their broken minds subconsciously acted out that exact fear. It wasn't the bread that poisoned them, it was the sheer weight of their own despair. The Dancing Plague of 1518 remains one of the most bizarre and terrifying events in human history. Whether it was poisoned rye or a collective break from reality caused by unbearable suffering, it leaves us with a chilling realization. Under enough pressure, the human mind can become its own worst enemy. Our bodies can become prisons, driven by invisible forces we don't fully understand. Strasbourg eventually recovered. The wooden stage was destroyed, the dead were buried, and the music finally stopped. But the echoes of those frantic footsteps still haunt the pages of history, reminding us of the fragile line between sanity and madness. If you found this journey into the unknown fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Unseen Past. We bring history's darkest, most mysterious, and forgotten moments back to life. Hit the notification bell and join us next time as we uncover another secret from the unseen past.